Welcome back, Focus Learners, to our continuation explainer on critical situation management. Okay, let's dive into this. Now, before your eyes completely glaze over hearing the words ITIL concepts, just stay with me for a second. You absolutely do not need to sit through some grueling 4-day certification course, or, memorize a massive 600-page manual to be a truly great CritSit manager. So that's the good news. And the better news? There are really just a handful of ITIL concepts that will genuinely, literally change how you think and communicate during a crisis. We're going to cover exactly those today. Completely stripped of all the heavy jargon, fully grounded in real situations, and most importantly, actually useful for you.
Let's get into it. This masterclass is broken down into 6 structured sections. We'll start with basic concepts, move right through diagnostics and escalation, tackle major incidents and emergency change, and finish up with PIR and RCA.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 1, Basic Concepts and Distinctions.
So in ITIL, an incident has a very specific definition. It's any unplanned interruption to or degradation of a service. Simple enough, right? But here's what actually surprises a lot of people. That definition says absolutely nothing about knowing the root cause, and it says nothing about widespread impact either. The exact moment service quality drops below what was promised to the customer, boom, that's an incident. Full stop. Even if your entire engineering team is just standing around going, well that's weird. And this matters way more than it sounds, because the definition also tells you what your #1 priority must be. It's not diagnosis, it is restoration. Think about it like this. If a simple rollback can get your service back to normal in, say, 10 minutes, but figuring out why it broke will take 3 hours, you do the rollback, right now. The investigation can wait, but your customers definitely cannot. This is absolutely the single most important mindset shift in incident management, and honestly, it's the one that teams violate the most. Don't be that bridge where everyone's furiously debugging while users are still down. Fix first, understand second.
Now, if an incident is the actual fire, a problem is the faulty wiring that caused it in the first place. Formally speaking, a problem is the underlying cause behind one or more incidents. And problem management? Well, that's what kicks off after the CritSit bridge closes. It's the structured, much calmer investigation into why this whole thing happened and how to make sure it never happens again. Now let's talk about why this distinction is genuinely so useful in practice.
When you are running a live CritSit bridge and someone on the call inevitably starts going super deep into root cause theory, hypothesizing, debating, drawing complex architecture diagrams in their head, you now have a framework to redirect them. And you do it politely, but firmly and professionally. You just say, that's a great question for the problem record. Right now, let's focus on restoration. Seriously, that one single sentence keeps your bridge totally on track. The incident bridge is for getting the service back online. The problem record is for understanding why it went offline. 2 distinct lanes, 2 distinct purposes. Do not mix them up.
Okay, here's one concept that really doesn't get enough love: the known error. A known error is a documented problem where the root cause is already completely understood, even if a permanent fix hasn't actually been deployed yet. Kind of think of it as your team's collective memory captured in writing. Why does this matter so much during a CritSit? Well, because if someone has seen this exact same failure pattern before and it's been properly recorded, that vital information should surface in the first 5 minutes of your response, not halfway through hour 2. Imagine someone chiming in with, hey, this looks exactly like the known error we documented back in March. Same exact symptoms, here is the workaround. Wow, that single sentence can literally save 2 entire hours of painful reinvestigation, 2 hours of engineers just staring blankly at logs, 2 hours of angry customers waiting around. So listen, if your team doesn't have a known error database, or if you have one that nobody ever actually updates or checks, that is a massive gap worth fixing today. It's not just some boring ITIL checkbox. It's real operational capital, and it grows in value every single time something breaks. And trust me, things will always break.
Now that our foundational terms are locked in, let's shift to Section 2, Diagnostics and Change Management.
So the crucial point is, here's a pattern that shows up so consistently in major incidents that it's practically a universal law of nature. Something changed recently. Okay, maybe not always, but often enough that the very moment you don't immediately know why something is broken, your absolute first question should be, what changed in the last 24 hours? It almost sounds too simple, doesn't it? But this single golden question has resolved more incidents faster than any massive amount of log diving or emergency all-hands calls ever could. So what kinds of changes are we actually talking about here? Let's walk through the usual suspects together.
First up, application deployments. Yep, even the ones that passed absolutely every test and every single review. Production just has a funny way of humbling everyone. Then, infrastructure changes. A tiny load balancer tweak or maybe a security group update. Something that seemed totally harmless at 2 p.m., but magically morphed into a full-blown CritSit by 4 p.m. Next, database changes. Schema migrations, index operations, parameter tuning. Databases are super sensitive, folks. Treat them accordingly. Oh, and certificate renewals, or let's be real, more accurately, forgotten certificate renewals. This one is practically a rite of passage in IT. At some point in your CritSit career, you are going to work a massive Sev 1 that just turns out to be an expired cert, and you will feel a lot of emotions about that. We also have firewall or network rule changes. Especially in environments with lots of microservices, one single blocked port can cascade in ways literally nobody expected. Then there's dependency or third-party library upgrades. Someone updated a little package, it introduced a breaking change, and nobody noticed until it hit production. Finally, configuration management runs. Like a Terraform apply or an Ansible playbook that quietly modified something in the background, these are super sneaky because they often don't even feel like changes to the people who actually ran them.
Now, one really important thing about exactly how you ask this question. Your tone matters immensely. You are not pointing fingers. You're definitely not implying someone broke something on purpose. You are simply using change history as a diagnostic shortcut. You've got to frame it that way every single time. Try saying, just to narrow things down a bit, what do we know about recent changes? That is exactly the energy you want to bring.
Moving right along, let's transition into Section 3, Escalation and Service Levels.
And this brilliantly illustrates a key distinction you absolutely must master. There are two fundamentally different reasons to escalate during a CritSit, and they require completely different actions. First, functional escalation. This is when you just need more expertise. The folks currently on the bridge simply don't have deep enough knowledge of the specific system, component, or layer that's failing. So what do? You bring in someone who does. A senior SRE, a database specialist, a network engineer, or even a vendor support tech. This is by far the most common type of escalation during an active incident. On the flip side, we have hierarchical escalation. This happens when you need more authority. There's a big decision on the table that nobody currently on the call actually have the power to make. Maybe it's approving an emergency change, or authorizing a massive production failover, or escalating to executive stakeholders. That is when you bring in the engineering manager, director, VP, or executive sponsor. So here's a quick test to run in your head whenever you feel like you need to escalate. Ask yourself, what is actually blocking me right now? If the answer is knowledge, call the right specialist. That's functional escalation. But if the answer is a decision nobody here can make, go straight up the chain, hierarchical escalation. Getting this right consistently while under immense pressure, that's actually one of the clearest signs of a CritSit manager who truly knows what they're doing.
Now let's talk about the SLA, which stands for Service Level Agreement. And if you're managing CritSits, the SLA isn't just some dusty document in a contract somewhere. It is the literal clock on the wall that everyone in the room is watching, whether they admit it or not. Formally, an SLA is a documented agreement between a service provider and a customer that clearly defines what service will be delivered and to exactly what standard. But in real-world practice for a CritSit manager, it answers one incredibly important question. How much time do we have before we are officially in breach? SLAs typically define two key timelines. First, the response time, meaning how quickly you acknowledge and engage on an incident. And second, the resolution time, how quickly you actually restore the service. And here's the kicker. Both of those clocks start the exact moment the incident is logged. Not when you finally noticed it, not when the angry customer escalated it, when it was logged. Here's a tricky thing that catches a lot of people totally off guard. You can actually breach an SLA on response time even if you end up fixing the incident super quickly. If that ticket just sat there completely unacknowledged for 4 hours before anyone even touched it, the response SLA might already be gone, regardless of how heroic your eventual fix was. The clock simply doesn't care about your heroics. So why does this matter beyond the obvious? Because your SLA status should directly influence your escalation decisions. An incident that is at high risk of breaching its SLA in the next 30 minutes has to be treated entirely differently from one that still has 4 hours of headroom. Knowing the SLA isn't just an administrative chore, it's a live, critical operational input that shapes how urgently you move, who you loop in, and exactly when you escalate hierarchically to get leadership involved way before a breach happens, not after.
Now let's step right up to Section 4, Handling Major Incidents.
Look, not every incident is a full-blown CritSit, but some incidents are so serious that your standard everyday response process just simply isn't built to handle them. And that is exactly where ITIL's concept of the major incident comes into play. A major incident is formally defined as an incident with significant business impact that requires a separate elevated response procedure.
Think of it as a threshold, a very clear line that, once crossed, triggers everything you'd normally associate with a full-scale CritSit. We're talking a dedicated bridge, a specifically named incident manager, high-level executive communication, and a response team assembled purely around that one massive issue. Now, the exact criteria for what counts as a major incident definitely varies by organization, and that's actually intentional in ITIL. Some orgs define it by the sheer number of customers affected. Others look strictly at revenue impact. Others look at whether critical core infrastructure is down. What really matters is that your organization has a clear, agreed-upon definition. Because the second an incident qualifies as major, a completely different set of actions kicks into gear. And here is the really crucial thing. The major incident declaration is a decision. It is not a discovery. Somebody has to step up and make that call. Waiting around for absolute 100% certainty before declaring a major incident is a classic common mistake, and it costs you incredibly precious response time. If all the signals are pointing toward major, like escalating impact, no quick fix in sight, customers literally screaming, declare it early. You can always scale it back later, but you absolutely cannot get back those 45 minutes you lost just because nobody wanted to be the one brave enough to say the words. As a CritSit manager, this declaration is very often yours to make. Own it.
Sometimes, applying that crucial fix requires bypassing standard procedures. This brings us to Section 5, Emergency Change Protocols.
Here is a scenario that every single CritSit manager will eventually face. You're on the bridge, the team has successfully identified a brilliant fix, but deploying that fix requires a change to production. And your organization's standard change process, well, that takes 48 hours, 2 agonizing approval meetings, and a formal sign-off from someone who is currently sipping margaritas on holiday in Bali. That, my friends, is where the emergency change comes in. In ITIL, an emergency change is a change that absolutely must be implemented as quickly as possible due to a live incident or a critical business need, one that simply cannot wait for that standard, slow change approval process. It has its own highly streamlined process, which often involves a much smaller approval group called an Emergency Change Advisory Board, or ECAB, which can convene super fast to assess and approve the change. Now listen closely, because this is a critical point. Emergency change does not mean skip the process entirely. No way. It means run a faster, leaner version of the process. There is still a vital approval step. There is still a risk assessment, even if you're hashing it out in 5 minutes flat on the bridge. And there absolutely, unequivocally, must still be a rollback plan. If your emergency change accidentally makes things worse, you need to know exactly how to undo it before you push that button. I really want to emphasize this last part, because in the chaotic heat of a CritSit, rollback planning can feel like such an annoying inconvenience, but it isn't. Let me be clear, an emergency change without a rollback plan is just a reckless gamble with your production environment. Always, always confirm the rollback before the change goes in. The other thing you really need to keep in mind, emergency changes are a leading cause of new incidents. Now that's not a reason to avoid them entirely. Sometimes they are absolutely the right call to make, but it is a very good reason to treat them with immense respect, to move deliberately, and to make sure the right people have their eyes on the change before it is executed.
Finally, we reach our last operational section, Section 6, Post-Incident Reviews and RCA.
Okay, so the CritSit bridge has closed, the service is completely restored, everyone breathes a huge sigh of relief, thanks each other, and slams their laptops shut. Job done, right? Well, not quite. In ITIL, the end of an incident, especially a major incident, triggers one of the most incredibly valuable yet most frequently skipped parts of the entire process, the post-incident review, or PIR. The PIR is a highly structured review session, typically held within 24 to 72 hours of a major incident being resolved, while all the gritty details are still fresh in everyone's minds. Its purpose is super straightforward. What happened? Why did it happen? What did we do really well? What did we do poorly? And most importantly, what are we going to do differently next time? And feeding directly into this PIR is the root cause analysis, or RCA. The RCA is your technical deep dive, the rigorous, methodical investigation that traces the entire chain of events all the way back to the actual true root cause. Not just the symptom, not just the immediate trigger, the real underlying cause. There's a very good reason why saying the database went down is almost never an acceptable root cause. The real root cause is why the database went down, and quite often why the alerting completely failed to catch it sooner, and why the team's first 3 attempted fixes didn't work at all.
One incredibly powerful technique worth knowing for your RCA is the 5 whys. It's a deceptively simple method where you take absolutely any finding and just ask why 5 times in rapid succession. Each answer logically becomes your next question. I know, it almost sounds childish at first, until you actually try it in a real scenario and suddenly find yourself 3 levels deeper than you ever expected, staring directly at a glaring process gap that nobody had noticed for 2 whole years.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the deep, fundamental focus on culture. A genuinely good PIR produces exactly two things: a clear, factual account of what happened, and a rigorous set of concrete action items, each with a clear owner and a firm due date, to either prevent recurrence or significantly improve the response. We are not talking about vague recommendations here, not just, oh, we should probably look at our alerting sometime. No, specific actions assigned to specific people with specific hard deadlines. And here is the cultural point that matters more than anything else. The PIR absolutely must be blameless. The goal here is not to find out exactly who made a mistake so we can punish them. The goal is to understand exactly why the system itself, the processes, the tooling, the training, the monitoring, actually allowed a human mistake to have the massive impact it did. Blame completely shuts people down, but curiosity? Curiosity makes teams so much stronger. As a CritSit manager, actively owning the PIR and RCA process is hands down one of the most impactful things you can possibly do. Because honestly, anyone can manage a bridge call, but the managers who consistently run good, blameless postmortems, they are the ones who actually tangibly reduce incident frequency over time.
Quick recap before we move on. 9 essential concepts. Let's really lock these in. Incident, service is degraded. Restore first, diagnose second. Problem, the actual root cause. Investigated after the bridge closes, definitely not during. Known error, a documented problem. Surface it early, save hours of pain. Change connection. When in doubt, just ask what changed and ask it early. Escalation types. Remember, functional is for expertise, hierarchical is for authority. Know the difference. SLA, the clock that is always running. Know your exact breach timeline way before you actually need it. Major incident, the big threshold that changes absolutely everything. Declare it early and own the call. Emergency change, it's a faster process, but it is not no process. Always have a rollback plan. And finally, PIR and RCA. The bridge closing isn't the finish line. This is where the real structural learning happens. All right, that is your ITIL toolkit for CritSits. It's not the full, massive framework, just the core parts that actually show up in the real work.
Now let's build on them. You have the toolkit mapped out right here, ready to go. But the real, ultimate question is this: will you actually step up and run the kind of deep, blameless postmortems that truly reduce incident frequency over time? It's entirely in your hands. Take these tools, apply them under pressure, and completely transform your incident response.